So is there a better way? So a complicated but powerful concept is called activity-based costing, ABC. And the concept is easy. It's over here before you look at the complicated thing on the right. Your product should be charged based on how much it uses from the overhead departments. So if it uses a lot, it should get charged a lot. If it doesn't use a lot, it should not get charged a lot. That's the logic of it. It's pretty hard to argue with that. Now, if we're doing this in companies, then it gets complicated. Why does it get so complicated? It seemed like such a simple idea. Well, the reason is that there are quite a few different costs that are broken into a lot of different units, cost centers or product groupings. So we have these resources, and we have n number of resources. And each of those resources do specific things for multiple products. So now I'm an engineering department. I serve the manufacturing lines, but I help every manufacturing line for every product we make. So now we have to say, okay, how much did you spend? So you pool the cost in your activity pool for your engineers, and let's say it's $10 million a year. Then you say, well, how do I charge my $10 million to all the products that roll through this factory? And it might be based on the assignments that you give to your engineers to go support the manufacturing process. So there's bookkeeping involved in saying, okay, let's then allocate the timesheets of the engineers and say, how much time did you spend on the lines to support products, and delineate which products you supported with how much time. A lot of work. So you can see if you do this for every single overhead department that supports the manufacturing of a complicated company, you get this thing that looks like spaghetti on the right side. In this example, thank God, we have a simple, much simpler scenario, right? So we'll go back to Excel. So now we have still the same sales. We have still the same amount of costs, but instead we're going to base it on the drivers. So again, we have a cost pool. In this case, order processing is a pool. And then we have the total cost, which was $1.2 million. You take $1.2 million divided by the total number of invoices processed, and you get a cost per invoice process of $152. Customer service, let's say that they handle returns. So you say, okay, the $750,000 is servicing about 1,000 returns during the year. So that means every return costs us $736 to process. Now we say, okay, how many invoices were issued for product line number 1? Here it's 862. So the charge should be number of invoices times the cost per invoice. And again, let's lock that with F4 and copy it. And then we allocated the full 1.2 million as we did before. But we didn't do it on a percent of sales. We did it based on which ones are tedious with lots of invoices and which ones are easier where we have fewer invoices with bigger amounts. This would capture that difference. Then we say, okay, returns. Which products have large or small numbers of returns? So 20 returns for the first product. Each return costs us $700 to process. F4 to lock. Copy it. And that equals the 750. So in total, we know we're in good shape. Total allocated is the sum, $1,950,000. Now we can do the same thing as net, is take the sales minus the cost equals net. And here is the result of what we just did based on ABC. And we see this not all at 96% now. Why? Because let's take an example. This one's a pretty bad example. This is a line item, the parts, where there seems to be a lot of work involved, a lot of invoices, a lot of returns. So it absorbs a disproportionate amount of costs for such a small line item. It's only $1.6 million in total revenue. So this particular margin is slammed because it's really high cost. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum. Who did we charge too much to? And what we see here is 99.6. So in other words, that product line, oh, it's the one we just talked about, product line number 6. We had charged it 24% of all the costs. It turns out it's a very light touch. Not that many invoices and not that many returns relative to the massive size of the volume of sales. So we should have been charging it a very small amount, which comprises less than a percent. So we way overcharged this product for the overhead. I think with this example, you see that although it's more complicated to do an ABC style of allocation, it's much more precise and more fair or more objective in charging to the product lines the amount of money that should be charged because they use those resources. If you use the resources, pay. If you don't use the resources, don't pay. And we saw examples of that where the parts need to pay, so we charge them more. Whereas product line number 6 doesn't use that much, so we don't charge them as much. So this is kind of in the spirit and a good illustration of the value of using ABC. Next, we'll look at business models, and this is just showing the relationships between the financial elements of the income statement and the balance sheet, and that we can use that as different levels. There are Excel sheets for each of these. I'll just show you here because it's quite easily visible. And this is just saying for our same model company, Roberts Manufacturing, what are your revenues? How do those comprise as percent of revenues in terms of the cost of sales, the R&D, the SG&A, and that gives us some diagnostics on how profitable we are and where we spend our costs. Then the next section below deals with asset utilization. So how well are we managing our balance sheet? So the first couple deal with our working capital, the inventory and receivables. Are we turning over fast? And if you recall from our prior class, they're not very fast. Here it takes them 73 days to collect their sales. That's slow. It should be 30, right, in general. Next, inventories, 146 days. That's also very slow. That takes them many months to sell their inventory. So we're seeing elements here which are quite illuminating, not in a good way, that we're highlighting some potential problems. That bears some further investigation. The other elements of turnover are other elements of the capital and the assets. Fixed assets, total operating capital, and also total assets. So we're just seeing how well we utilize assets to generate sales. The next category is leverage. How much debt do we use compared to equity? And here, the debt to total capital is 15%. That's not that large use of debt. And the bottom shows some measures of return. The first is return on equity at 17.6, and it's simply net income divided by equity. The last item here is return on invested capital. The invested capital comprises not only equity, but also debt. Debt in the form of a loan from a bank and debt in the form of a bond. So invested capital equals loans plus bonds plus equity. So since that denominator got bigger, it's going to bring down the return number from the ROE number of 17 to the ROIC number of 15. And it goes down because we have some debt. The next is we could use the same approach where we have these metrics, put them in orderly fashion. And here we're looking at 6 different companies, from Accenture to IBM to Apple to Southwest Air. So very different industries with different economics entirely. This actually highlights the difference in the businesses and their economics. We see a company like Apple with high revenue growth, 8%. And we also see they have good margins at 39%. Then we have another company like, what's a good example? Southwest Airlines. It's a well-run airline, but their EBITDA margin is 4%, way less than Apple. This particular type of analysis uses the same kind of things that we did when we look at Roberts Manufacturing, but now we're doing it across different companies in an industry, or in this case, across different industries. Next, we use the same type of lens to evaluate inside of our company, but at a product line or a division level. Here we break our company into different groupings of equipment versus components, high growth versus mature parts of our product portfolio. And again, we use the same metrics. If you look at the rows here, there's still R&D, their gross margins, net margin, DSO, DSIs. So we use the same metrics across different scenarios, and they all give us some insights.